Hi, okay, chat about the universal carrier, but before I do that, an update on the scale issue of how close 72nd and 76th end up being. So I measured, there was a couple of good comments, thanks for the comments. I measured the universal carrier and scaled it to 172nd and 176th, around 2 millimeters on this size vehicle. The Tiger 1 tank, as someone mentioned, quite a visible difference, and in fact that turns out to be I think just a bit over 5 millimeters, or even up to 5.2 or 3 or something like that. Now obviously that's the full length including the barrel. The hull alone would probably be around 4 millimeters or so, but that is significant. So if you put a 172nd Tiger and 176th Tiger next to each other, it would be pretty obvious. If you put the universal carriers next to each other, it would still be obvious, even though it's only 2 millimeters difference. It would probably be somewhat insignificant on the scale of a figure. So yes, interesting the way they handled those scales, and thanks for the comments. Okay, I have been cutting the universal carrier, which I'll show you, and only picked up one cut on my finger, and that wasn't while cutting, although I must say this is of the most dangerous stuff that I do, because there's just so much holding the blade. I'm using the back of the blade, and you know, cutting within confined spaces and trying to get an accurate cut, but I've done it. So that is the result of the week's work, which is very, very good. I also did in fact thin out the side pieces from about 1 millimeter to maybe 0.4 at this stage. The sort of limiting factor is it starts getting very flimsy, so I think that's good enough. Most of the uprights as they go onto the universal carrier will look a lot more scale now that I see it like that, compared to, well, this one's pretty horrendous, and not that you see those, but I mean the plastic thickness there you can see is quite extensive. Where's one I haven't done? There's, for instance, the little stands for the people. You can see it is quite a thick plastic. Anyway, then as I was sort of closing down on getting that out, I was thinking about the bottom piece, so putting the bottom piece onto the bottom to sort of judge how much space this has now given me. I pondered whether they'd actually done that correctly. Was the bottom of the hull, the bottom plate, actually in the correct position? And I looked at a number of side view pictures and it isn't. It should be a bit lower, but not only that, this plate had a single front slope and a single back slope on the kit, and it isn't like that on the real thing. On the actual universal carrier, you've got the short front plate, then a angled plate, and then the bottom, and they hadn't included that angle, and they just sort of run the bottom just so obviously that would lift it up by possibly 1 millimeter at the front. So that gives a bit more space. So the next step is to build in that the increased depth of the hole with some sheet plastic there. I have cleaned up. I was going to use sheet plastic, but I quite like the idea of gluing the bits onto the green. So I decided to keep the screen, take off the front and back angle pieces, since I have to modify this anyway, and that still has to be shortened to cater for that small upward slope near the front. Bent that slightly, correct, it was a bit warped, took off the ridges, so that's all good. That box, the engine box, will not be used whatsoever, and a small frame will be created out of very thin whatever I can find, possibly sprue, photo etch, if I can find you know, some pieces that sort of represent making a box like that, keeping in mind all of the sides and top pieces will be off. In other words, it'll have full view down to the engine there. And once I've sort of got this extended down and the bottom could be fitted, I won't be fitting the bottom because you need to be able to build in quite a bit of stuff under this driver's position. Foot pedals, some wires, some cables, etc. So there'll be a fair bit of building work on the bottom, not to mention the fact that the engine will then get mounted onto there. I found some very good detail on the engine, which, as I've said, doesn't quite look like this one, but it has given me some good material to start doing a mock-up even in that tiny scale. What else can I tell you about that so far? The one part which I haven't thinned is this front plate, due to its shape, obviously, and I'm still thinking about that. I could achieve thinning one of the parts fairly easily, but working inside that part is going to be a little bit of a challenge. But I can't have all the plates thinned but this piece not thinned. But anyway, that's I'm very happy with that, and this would be one of those models that I really enjoy doing because of the amount of improvement that you can do in a fairly basic manner. Unlike maybe an airframe, which may involve a lot of improvements, but on a complex shape, this is, all basically flat steel bolted plates and so on. So it's actually quite a nice vehicle to work on, and small. A lot of tiny detail can be added. So we'll see how that one turns out. I'm looking forward to that. And then I was pondering a diorama board with it on, and possibly so the figures standing around, and possibly a little table with some small tools, or what looks like, at least, not a workshop setting, but at least a little bit of tinkering on the engine while in place. In other words, not major work. And then I found this one amongst my stuff, which probably would work better. It looks better and it would probably work better. So that will become a small diorama base. The figures I have from the kit and a little table can be scratch built out of scrap wood from the model ship stuff. And tools in 1/72 scale can be printed. You just find an image of tools on a table, bring it down to the size you want and print it, and it'll look reasonable. And then you can put a couple of little clippings of wire and stuff onto the table to give a slight impression of some items are in relief as opposed to the rest of the print, which is flat. But I think it'll work. So that's where we are with that. that's something else I could mention. The side view plastic thickness is no problem, because although those mud guards were very thin, much thinner, they certainly weren't 10mm, they had a bent over edge to give them a little bit of rigidity, and that amount of bent over edge could be represented by what you see there. So no problem to leave that as such, except possibly for those right at the back. So those ones, side view is too thick, so I might take those off and redo, or thin them off and put them back into position. And I think that's all good then. So I've improved the kit to the point where we can start looking at it as a kit that can be built to have a fair amount of detail. Those little tail lights then need to be drilled out, and I need to put in red LEDs. And then I need to figure out how to run the wires for headlights and tail lights in that minimal space that I have, in such a way that they actually look real and acceptable. So that's another little challenge, but it'll be worth it. Okay, I think that's all for the universal carrier tonight.